Never say never. There's a sporting event where if it goes its full amount of time, it lasts 6 minutes. You know what event that is? Somebody whispered it here. Wrestling. A wrestling match is made up of 3 2-minute periods. And if it goes its full length, it lasts exactly 6 minutes. When I was in school, we didn't really have high school or middle school or elementary school. We just had a school. And for some reason, I don't know why, when I was in 8th grade, I decided I wanted to wrestle. And so I gave up my pursuit of my basketball career, and I went out for the wrestling team. And I made the varsity team in 8th grade wrestling at 103 pounds. Not much, you know, more than I am now. I remember my very first match. It lasted about 30 seconds. When suddenly I was doing an inventory of the lights at the top of the ceiling in the gymnasium. But I hung in there. And towards the end of my 8th grade year, I won my first match in Larimore. I beat somebody. And what's interesting about that event is that I forgot my socks. Now I know that's hard for you to believe. But I unpacked my wrestling gear and I didn't have any socks. So I went without any. I just put my wrestling shoes on and laced them up. And I won that match, and so for the rest of my wrestling career, I never wore socks. Just shows you how superstitious we get. I did a little better the next year, a little better the next year. Did really well the last 2 years. And there were a couple of moves that I had that I got down pretty well. One of them was called a fireman's carry. It was a takedown move. I got to be really good at that. And the other, I don't even know if it's legal anymore, was called a figure 4. And when you were on top, you'd roll the guy down on his wrist. You'd sort of lean too far over the front of him, and the natural thing is to put your hips up and get up on your knees, your back. Boom, my leg would go across his midsection. I'd lock it with my other leg, and then I'd squeeze. From that moment on, he was mine. Now, you weren't supposed to squeeze, but sometimes if they weren't cooperating, you just add a little pressure. And the ref, he'd go, no, can't squeeze, can't squeeze. No, not squeezing. But you learn some things, some techniques that some might say are actually kind of dirty tricks, like squeezing. Another one is if you pop them in the head. Now you can do that as long as you don't slap them. That's the rule. And so you have to be very careful about that. But every now and then what you could do is instead of slapping them, you would just put your fingers and punch them. And it would throw them off just long enough. Techniques. cheap shots. Today we have a scripture text from Genesis that introduces us to a man who spent his whole life taking cheap shots. In fact, he was the king of cheap shots. His name was Jacob. He took a cheap shot at his father, tricking him into believing he was Esau. He took a cheap shot at his brother, Esau, by stealing his birthright. When Esau said, "You're a dead man," he runs. And there he exchanges cheap shots with what would be his father-in-law. His father-in-law lobbed the first cheap shot. When he wanted to marry Rachel, he finds out he's married to Leah. But Jacob gets even. Steals his cattle. Steals his idols. The king of cheap shots. But he's worn out his welcome. He's burned all of his bridges, and he has but one option. He's going to have to go back home. For when he left, Esau said, "When I see you again, you're a dead man." And so the day before this meeting, because he knows his brother Esau is coming with 400 men, he takes his last cheap shot. He takes his animals, his children, and his wives, and he puts all of them up front, thinking maybe Esau will be, I don't know, a little more open to compromise. And in the reading for today, you see Jacob sitting by the ford of the Jordan, alone. And suddenly, he finds himself in a wrestling match. Not for 6 minutes, but for all night. Now it's here that this text becomes interwoven with a whole bunch of mythology. There was a belief in that time that there were in fact demons who resided in the rivers, and the demons would come out at night. And it's clear from the dialogue that Jacob doesn't know exactly who or what he's wrestling. But he wrestles all night long. Now it's here where this text takes on a different flavor. Think of this man, a scoundrel, a cheat, a cheap shot artist, sitting there by himself, perhaps pondering his life. Perhaps Jacob is really wrestling with no one other than himself. He's coming to terms with the kind of person he has been. But he wrestles all night long. When I worked in clinical settings, I would use this text. And initially people would kind of respond to that, going, "Oh, we can't get religious here." I said, this is nothing to do with religion. But I often thought about when someone goes into a clinical setting, they have a tendency to feel an awful lot like Jacob, alone, abandoned, afraid with what awaits. And in that process of being in there, coming to terms with what they had done, who they had been. You see, we all need a Jacob moment. A willingness to come eyeball to eyeball with who we are and what we have done. And then I would suggest to the people that maybe what we should do, as you exit the clinic, to go back and be reunited with your family, the same family who had been hurt by your actions. Maybe we should stand at the door with a baseball bat and whack you in the hip, so that at least you walk away from that encounter limping, so people can see that you have in fact been in the fight of your life. Because when they just look at you, they don't see you any differently. You don't look any differently. Maybe you look a little healthier. And so it's hard to see the true struggle that you've been engaged in. You see, Jacob walks away from that struggle limping. But he also walks away with a new name and a new purpose. It wasn't all that long ago in the church where when it came to baptism, the child's name was never revealed until the moment when the pastor would ask the parents, "How shall this child be named?" And at that moment, you would reveal the name. Martin Luther used this as a basis for his understanding of baptism. Having come through the waters of the ford of the Jabbok, we walk towards the rising sun with a new name and a new purpose. We need that Jacob struggle. We need that moment when we're willing to become honest with who we are and what we have done. To allow that baptismal promise to once again flow over us. With a new identity and a new purpose. So I have a proposal. In a couple of weeks, we are going to go through what's called affirmation of baptism. And we have 5 incredible, wonderful people who will be going through this process. But I think maybe what we should do is smack them around. Just whack them in the hip. So that they come back limping. Shall we vote? All in favor, say aye. Yeah. We need to understand the struggle. The struggle which brings alive that promise. For as I told the young people, without struggle, there is no growth. And so, like Jacob, whose name is now Israel, goes forth towards that rising sun. So too we who have walked through the waters of baptism cleansed of our past, are set forth on a road with a new purpose. To be delight, love for all.